We don't need to do the zone 2 workouts that are being pushed so much.
What is the biggest misconception about women's health?
How fasting is so great, but it is not great for women.
A leader in the female sports research, Dr. Stacy Sims has dedicated her career to pioneering science-backed research in exercise nutrition and performance focused on women.
When you go into a gym, take up space. Be the woman that walks confidently back to the lifting platform. Don't be the woman that gets pushed to the cardio machine and introduced to the little pink dumbbells. If someone pushes you that way in a gym, turn around and walk out.
Calories in is calories out. If you eat too much, you put too much weight on. It's not as easy as that.
It's not. Right. It's not at all. You eat 3 cookies, you have to spend so much time on the treadmill. I'm like, that is not what it's about. The recommended daily intake for protein for women has been based on sedentary older men and really poor nitrogen studies. It is so incredibly important for women to get at least per kilo of body weight per day.
But it's 0.75 grams per kilo of body weight is what we're recommended in the UK for women.
I get so frustrated with it because
what do you say on the research around the intermittent fasting?
When I say fasting is overstated and one of the worst things for women, it's because
we want to make sure these conversations get to as many people as possible. By following this show and leaving a review, you can help these conversations reach the people they need to. If you send a screenshot of your follow and review to @SarahAnnMacklin, I'll pick 3 of you to come down to the studio to meet me and the guest I'm interviewing and watch the recording live. In your email and message to me, don't forget to also let me know who you'd like to see on the show. Stacey, welcome to Live Well, Be Well. I am extremely excited to have you on from the other side of the world. And I want to get straight stuck into one of the most memorable, uplifting lines I have ever heard in a TED Talk, which is "Women are not small men." And this was only in 2019. And part of what you said in the opening of that is 51% of the population are women, yet so much general science, but also health and fitness is tailored to men or studied on men. So men really are the anomaly. And I can just remember that so clearly. So I actually want to start there, where men are the anomaly. And from all of the work that you have done and pioneered in women's health, what is the biggest misconception about women's health that you are still hearing on the circuit that we need to flatten right here, right now?
I am staring at my other computer screen that has like 16 different tabs open with fasting articles. How fasting is so great, but it is not great for women, especially exercising women.
So I'm going to say in over, I think 300 episodes we've done now, we've had lots of different scientists on, from Dr. Sachi Panda to Mindy Feltz, a whole range of people talking about fasting, okay? Give me your top line for women. So sorry, men, but you should also listen to this for your partners and sisters and mothers. Give me your top line on intermittent fasting or fasting in general, because there's so many different types of fasting for women.
Women do better in a fed state. And when we look at chronobiology, women need to feed their bodies during the day when they are awake to keep their hormone pulse going in the right direction and give them energy when they need it so that they can get into a good deep sleep where all our reparation occurs.
What did you have for breakfast this morning?
I had a bowl of yogurt with berries, chia seeds, mixed nuts, some protein powder, some honey, and then two shots of espresso.
Would you say that's one of the, it's very hard because I know that you'll tailor things specific to women, so it's very hard to give generic advice, but would you say overall that is the ideal breakfast to wake up to start your day?
It's the ideal breakfast for women because we want to bring the cortisol down. Like you have the peak half an hour after waking up, is you want some good protein and some carb. And we also know that women don't get enough protein towards the second half of the day. So we try to load it towards the beginning of the day and it has a better impact on the body with regards to keeping amino acids going, keeping energy levels in check, helping with insulin sensitivity. And biggest thing really is maintaining our lean mass, because as we get older, you tend to lose it. And that's one of the things that we're finding. A lot of women are like, well, I want to hold a fast because, for XYZ, but underneath it all, it's because they're trying to have some kind of calorie restriction. Because when you start asking, what are the molecular mechanisms of fasting that you really want to get out of fasting, most of them can't say anything. They don't know. They've heard autophagy, but what does that mean? Do you know that it means that you're trying to upregulate certain proteins in your skeletal muscle so that it will go and get all the cellular debris? Is that what you're talking about? They kind of have a blank face. So when we're talking about, you want protein, especially in the morning, to help with our cortisol pulse, people freak out. They're like, what do you mean cortisol has a pulse? Help with our estrogen and our progesterone and our
Explain.
testosterone pulse? A pulse?
Cortisol pulse. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we see cortisol has this bad rap, right? When we say, oh, I have elevated cortisol, but our body responds very well across the day. I mean, that's how we're able to bring our heart rate up. That's how we're able to be alert. So we have a peak that comes about a half an hour before we wake up, because that's the body naturally waking up to become alert, like what's happening in the day. And you're in a catabolic state. So if you don't do something to bring that cortisol down, specifically some protein and some good carb, you're going to stay in this catabolic state. So instead of, like in men, if men stay in a catabolic state, it upturns testosterone and lean mass. But for women, when we're in this kind of catabolic sympathetic drive, when you first wake up, it just perpetuates lean mass loss, because lean mass is very metabolically active. And the hypothalamus is saying, hey, I need some nutrition to get through this little bit of stress of waking up and starting the day. And I don't see any coming in. I don't have any senses of carbohydrate coming in. I don't have any senses of protein coming in, but I need some amino acids. I need some glucose. So it starts breaking down and signaling to break down lean mass. So when we complicate it by someone getting up first thing in the morning, going to the gym to lift weights or to go for a run, and they're already in this catabolic state and they're signaling, oh, I want to build fitness. But the brain is saying, no, I want to break it down because I need some of the parts in order to keep continuing. A lot of times women are like, I don't understand why I'm not getting fitter. It's because you're fighting this natural rhythm that your body undercurrent is in a survival mode. Every morning you wake up, it's like, okay, what's going on? What's going on? So the simplest thing a woman can do when she's trying to bring sympathetic drive down, to improve body composition, is to have some good protein and a little bit of carb within half an hour of waking up. And it doesn't mean a full meal at all. It could be a couple of tablespoons of yogurt with a little honey. I'm notorious for protein fortified coffee because I'm not that hungry right when I wake up, but it is something that's going to tell the hypothalamus, yeah, there's some nutrition coming in.
I love that you're bringing in the hypothalamus there in the brain, because you're connecting so much around something that I think is one of our strongest determinants of health, which is our mind over our body. And I think that you just answered a really good question there, because for women that don't wake up hungry, some people can say, well, I don't want to force myself to eat. Aren't I then going against my natural instincts if I'm trying to force myself to eat? So then people maybe overcomplicate it and get worried then hearing this. So what would your advice be there? Would it literally be, as you said, protein fortified coffee, which I'm guessing is adding protein into your coffee and sipping that in the morning as kind of starting the day?
Yeah, but you also want to add, like I add oat or almond milk for a little bit of carb as well. So it's not a lot. It's 15 grams of protein, which is equivalent of 1.5 tablespoons of protein powder. It could be third cup of Greek yogurt. That's about 15 grams. So it's not a lot. And part of it also is women have learned not to cue in to their hunger. So when you're talking about a lot of women who have been fasting or looking to delay hunger, they've gotten into the habit of just ignoring and not understanding what hungry means until they get into the later stages of the day. I know that I'm not really hungry until about 10 or 11, which is way too late for my body to work optimally. But that's because I've learned that situation through all of my years of training and, cross time zones and that kind of stuff. So I make a point to eat, even though I don't necessarily feel hunger cues.
So what do you say which I think is really important, on the research around the intermittent fasting, like Dr. Sachi Panda, who will have brought out all of his research, or Mindy Peltz, who will talk about fast for 72 hours when you're not on your period, and those 2 weeks before, make sure that you aren't fasting because that works with your hormone system. There's so many different types of information that, one, we have kind of spoken about on this show and brought people on for their opinions. What's your reaction to those kind of two ones that I actually just brought up?
When I've done a podcast with Mindy Peltz and talking about fasting, and we have two different mindsets there. It's like, I work in the active population. As soon as you start exercising, it's a fasted state. But regardless of what it is, even with looking at fasting as a whole, for women doing time-restricted eating, with the caveat that time-restricted means that you eat within a half an hour of waking up, you have dinner and nothing after dinner. So you have a good 12 to 14 hour fast. Like I say, it's just normal eating. But if you're getting into the weeds of research, like what a lot of the research that's open on the screen is talking about, like if you have a 12 to 14 hour fast, then you're going to garner a lot of the benefits of autophagy. You're going to have changes in your proteins to improve cellular debris uptake, and you're going to have the upregulation of skeletal muscle repair and all the things that you think about with fasting. But when it gets into the delayed food intake in the morning and your fasting window or your eating window is from 12 to like 7, there also has to be the caveat that the food that's in that eating window has to be nutritionally dense. And that isn't a conversation that's been had either. So there's lots of nuances around it. When I say fasting is overstated and one of the worst things for women, is because from where I'm coming from as an exercise physiologist, people are layering everything on. And when I get into the bottom of it and say, why exactly are you doing this? They want to, lose weight, or they want to be lighter, or they don't feel hungry. And it's all of these more sociocultural cues around it rather than looking at the basic physiology. And when I point out, look, if you're looking at fasting to garner all of these benefits, then you can't exercise. But if you are exercising, then you are getting a bigger stress on the body that's going to instigate better autophagy and better responses with blood sugar control, metabolic control, cardiovascular outcomes than if you were to do fasting. So you really want to pick one or the other. When you bring them together, they don't benefit each other, especially if you're doing exercise fasted. Works for men. Believe me, it works for men because men are not metabolically flexible. There are a lot of things within their mitochondria that needs help. And so fasted training works for men. But for women, it's a significant detriment to our parasympathetic activity, to our ability to maintain and build lean mass, our ability to improve our blood lipids, to improve VEGF for our endothelial function, our blood pressure, to improve our blood glucose responses. And this one study that I have open right now is talking about over the course of 12 weeks, where we had men who were doing intermittent fasting and women who were doing intermittent fasting. The men had better blood glucose responses and better insulin sensitivity at the end, but women were pre-diabetic. So there's lots of nuances in the literature that aren't spoken outwardly because everyone is so nuanced into just defaulting to what the primary male data says, and they don't question it. But when you come from my lens and been working with women for women for so long, I'm always digging in and going, wait a second, let's see what happens for the women. And then when you really start to dig into all of the popular fads, you see that it's really not appropriate for women.
As a nutritionist, one of the most common questions that I get asked is coffee good or bad for you? Yes, coffee is good for you, but the impact of the health benefits all comes down to how the coffee is sourced and made. What's really important to consider when choosing your coffee is knowing that not all coffee is created equally. I came across Exhale Coffee by Dr. Rupi, who oversaw 9 independent lab tests to ensure the coffee is sourced to maximize the polyphenol content. This is a potent antioxidant with anti-inflammatory properties to support overall health. Switching to a high polyphenol coffee like Exhale is also fantastic for your gut health and your brain health, because research has shown that these specific components may have a real impact on our immune response. It could even help support your oral microbiome when drinking up to 2 to 3 cups a day. but over 5 a day has been shown to have detrimental effects. Personally, I love to have my coffee an hour after waking up to allow my body to use its own natural energy resources within the first hour and to align with my circadian rhythm. What I also love about XL coffee is that it's also soil certification organic certified, which means that it's free from mycotoxins, pesticides and molds. Now, if you want to give your mornings a new routine and try XL Coffee, then head to www.xlcoffee.com/Sarah to get your free trial sent to you. I also think, putting this on a bigger lens, right, than just fasting, so much about diets, detoxes, trends are all formed towards women. We've had this little bit of a skew of a beast where we've got kind of like the bro culture coming up, which is again this optimized culture of how you should be doing things very specifically, and if you kind of derail, you're failing. So it's changed a bit of a beast, but generally, if you look at health advice over the last 50 years, it's all about making women smaller and leaner,
Yep.
right? It is.
Exactly.
And how do we get out of that? Like, how do we, because you mentioned something really interesting, which is calories, which is such a big thing, but around calories. And so many, especially men online, will be like, it's very easy. Calories in, it's calories out. If you eat too much, you put too much weight on. And it's such, I kind of see it and cringe in sadness because it's not as easy as
It's
that, in my
not.
opinion.
You're right. It's not
But
at all.
can you, one, explain why for
Yeah.
people listening? And two, like, how the hell do we get out of this as women that we're not also drained into this kind of new optimization culture as well?
I'll get into the calorie thing, but as we're talking, there was a meme that was going around last week that really did my head in. And I used it as an opening for a talk I gave last weekend, where the meme was, I want to be like the clothes that you throw in a dryer, where I come out non-wrinkled and 3 sizes smaller. And, all these women were laughing about it. And, you kind of think it's funny, but it's not. To me, I'm like, this is just a reiteration that women age out by the time they're 35. And there's such a social cultural thing in Western society that women need to stay a certain small size to be fit in this box that has been portrayed ever since the 1920s or even earlier than that. Like when we look at history,
The
history of sport
corsets.
and medicine, all of that, right? Just get really, really small. And that's what this whole calorie in, calorie out. I mean, even the popular magazines, and I'll call it out, like Women's Health at Christmas time. You eat 3 cookies, you have to spend so much time on the treadmill. I'm like, that is not what it's about. Because 4 calories of protein react in the body completely different than 4 calories of carbohydrate. And 4 calories of ultra processed carb is completely different from 4 calories of complex carb. So it's different. And then how old you are, there are different responses. If you've been training or untrained, genetics, everything, right? It's so wrapped up. And it just keeps getting perpetuated that it's calories in, calories out. And women need to be this small little size. And, like, unfortunately, I've been reading a lot about the impact of Ozempic on society right now. And there's the upsurge of the ballerina body because so many celebs have lost weight with Ozempic, but still have maintained a little bit of tone. And so now it's going back and pushing back to the 90s where we had like the supermodels who had a little bit of muscle tone and were super skinny. It's like, we don't need to go back there. Women need to take up space. And I always tell women, like, when you go into a gym, take up space. Be the woman that walks confidently back to the lifting platform and owns that space because we've worked hard to do that. Don't be the woman that gets pushed to the cardio machine and introduced to the little pink dumbbells because that doesn't do you any good. If someone pushes you that way in a gym, turn around and walk out.
Yeah, 100%. That was me for a sucker, the Tracy Anderson method. And from coming from the fashion industry and never being told to lift more than 3 kilos weights when I was doing, for anyone in the UK, I lived in America for many years, and Tracy Anderson was a huge fitness, and she still is there. And I don't want to sound like I'm demonizing her, but I always remember, and it's still in my mind, even though I've changed my weight training since speaking a lot to Dr. Tommy Wood on this, or Professor Tommy Wood on this podcast. Never lift more than 3 kilos, because if you lift more than 3 kilos, you're going to gain like bigger muscle mass, and that's not good for the lean body. And so I had this like thing that was stuck in my brain, as well as being a model in the industry. And I mean, obviously I was then totally screwed in what my kind of thought process was around this. But it is very much culturally dialed into us very, very deep. Even though now I'm more aware, I still have these niggles in the back of my mind, because for 21st years, it's all I thought about.
Yeah, I mean, it's still prevalent now. Like like I said, my daughter's 12, and so there's the input of social media and everything coming in, and her friends are talking about, oh, this person is so skinny and this person looks so great because they've lost weight. I was like, no, Jara, they're weak. They are weak. They can't lift anything. Like, you want to be strong, you want to run fast, you want to play soccer well, you want to be able to lift things, you want to be strong. So then she goes back, she's like, yeah, but they're weak. So it's just really switching that mindset of being strong and independent. And I think that's the rhetoric that we need to push out instead of pull back. So the more that we can talk about being strong and empowered, that allows women to have a different view of how they can fill a room.
So why does the calories in, calories out not work? Because I think this is a really important conversation, especially now. A lot of people in the UK are getting to things like high rocks, and they're doing a lot more weightlifting, and they're kind of getting into that more stronger mindset. But I still think the conversation around nutrition for women is not clear. And I do still think that the calorie conversation is still such a big thing, where people are tracking what they're eating, the calories that they're having. And I do remember even 5 years ago, there was a 500-day calorie limit that a lot of my peers were going on to help lose weight. There was one, I don't know, 10 years ago, the Special K diet, where you would eat 2
Oh,
bowls
yeah.
of cereal. Do you remember? And I
I
still think
remember.
these things are still there, but in just a slightly different context. So let's divulge, why is it not calories in, calories out? Why is that not good for our health?
Yeah, well, when we look at it, and I take it from the view of women, right? We look at it, women have two areas in the hypothalamus that are super sensitive to nutrient density. One controls our endocrine system, and the other one is more appetite control and immunity. So when we start trying to do calories in, calories out, we see that within 4 days of a low energy availability, you start to have a downturn of your thyroid and a flattening of your luteinizing hormone pulse. And we need to have our hormones pulsing in a certain fashion because we have a 24-hour circadian rhythm, but it's also from a cellular matrix as well as a whole body system. So when you start having interruptions to these pulses, you start having cellular disruption. So we start to see this early on in women. And the way that I point to it is, if we're looking at how many like baseline calories of good quality food that a woman needs in order just to maintain basic endocrine health, we're seeing that you have a perturbance starting at 35 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, but for men it's 15. So right there, if a man isn't eating as much, then he's going to lean up and get fitter and faster. When we see women who are delaying and not eating enough, they put on belly fat. They get a lot of disruption in the signaling for mitochondrial uptake of free fatty acids. So we start to have more what we call esterified fats floating around. And these esterified fats are a change in the molecular shape, I guess is the best way to put it, from a free fatty acid. So it can't get pulled in to the skeletal muscle and the mitochondria. It goes to the liver, and the liver is like, hey, I know what to do with this. I'm going to bind it up and store it as visceral fat, right? And the simple thing to break that chain is to have enough food, especially protein. So, we've come from the whole conversations of low fat, high carb, or low carb, high fat, right? No one's ever talked about protein. But the more research that's coming out about protein, the more we're seeing it is so incredibly important for women to get at least 1.6 grams per kilo of body weight per day. And this is even if you're just recreationally active. But then when you start seeing people who are training for high rocks, right? And the high, like I've been seeing the reels and things of people who are training for the first high rocks. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you are not eating enough and you're training too much. And it's a direct, like people used to call it overtraining. People then moved on to adrenal fatigue, but it's basically you're not giving your body enough food. You're not eating enough to maintain health. And I think this is where that whole like fasting thing comes in too, because people are now using it as an excuse to delay intake and have calorie restriction under a socially okay meme of how they're eating. Because, back in the 80s or even the 70s, if you said you were fasting, people would think that you belonged in the hate in San Francisco as part of the hippie tribe, right? But now it's socially acceptable.
Similar
So,
to
yeah,
yoga. If that was you
exactly.
40 years ago, you belonged in a hippie tribe. I really want to bring up that 1.6 grams per kilo, because just to put this into context for people that might not know where that sits with our recommendations, I'll talk about this from the UK because I'm not sure about America. But it's 0.75 grams per kilo of body weight is what we're recommended in the UK for women right now. So
That's
that's like
so
the
low.
base, that's like the level. That's not the baseline. That's like the recommended daily kind. So it's around 45 grams, I'd say, for like the average woman, which I just wanted to like put into context of what you're saying, which is 1.6. You're literally doubling it for the
Hmm.
minimum. So
Right.
that's the conversation that I think we need to be having, right? That you're talking about. Whereas like it's our public health guidelines at the moment that are, I guess, how we're looking in the UK, the Eat Well plate, right? It's quite
Hmm.
small on the protein. And if I'm thinking about the pyramid in America, again, the protein emphasis isn't
Small.
big. So how let's redefine it, Stacey. Let's
Yeah.
redefine a woman's. Can you not do this? Can you not build the woman's plate, the Eat Well plate for a woman?
Yeah, because like I don't think people realize that regardless of what country you're in, the recommended daily allowance or recommended daily intake is based on the minimal amount to avoid malnutrition. And the recommended intake for protein for women has been based on sedentary older men and really poor nitrogen studies. And
Didn't
they
mean to
use
laugh then,
sedentary.
but
No, I mean, it's funny, right? Because they're like, well, women don't want to go through nitrogen studies. They're delicate flowers. So we'll look at someone who has similar body composition. So we'll look at these older men who have higher body fat than younger men. How much do they need? Oh, well, that's what it's going to be for women. And that's how we've gotten these recommended daily intakes, right? And no one's gone back to look at it. Recently, they're starting to really look at protein and how important it is, because we're starting to see. I laugh at the irony of the fact that the whole world is malnourished. We have malnourishment from lack of food, and we have malnourishment of too many processed calories and shit food.
so I always say overnourished and undernourished at the same time.
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
overweight, but we're nutrient deprived.
exactly. Exactly. That's it, right? And I find it interesting being an expat when I'm in New Zealand and I see the food that's available here versus I go to the States, and I'll go to a grocery store in the States and there's rows and rows and rows of stuff they say is food, but I couldn't eat any of it because it's so ultra processed and just marketed with a whole bunch of stuff. And if you're not aware of that, you don't know how to choose. So I think that if we're going to look at a plate, like what is a woman's ideal plate, there needs to be the caveat of, if it has big marketing that says high protein and it's a Pop Tart, move away, right? This is what ultra processed food means. But generally, I mean, it's the old fashioned 30-40-40 rule, where 30% is protein, 30% is good fats, and 40% is complex carbs. And then you modify based on like who you are with regards to where you are in your lifespan, what kind of training you're doing, if you're traveling or not under high stress. Because if you're under a lot of high stress, you need to boost some carbs up just to keep your gut microbiome happy and to be able to have immune cells that are happy. So yeah, there's the little nuances within that, but basically that old fashioned 40-30-30 is really good. And then it's the distribution throughout the day that people need to nail. Where we're looking at, having food when you wake up and having regular protein throughout the day and really good complex carbs. And we can go to the 80-20 rule, where 80% you're doing that and 20% is life. But people put so many restrictive rules around what they're eating that they forget what it means to be nourished from a soul perspective, not just some physicality.
Hmm. Well, I mean, that's something that I dial in on my work a lot, especially if you also look at, work from Stanford with Aaliyah Crum, when she talks about, you could have the same meal, but your mindset, if you're told that you've got the FTO gene, which is the one that you're more predetermined to be obesogenic, which actually is a very small chance, by the way, that if you do have that, but
Yep.
never again, that's the information how they delivered it in the study, that if you have that same meal and you're either told that you have that gene or you don't, you will metabolize that meal totally differently. And I think That for me was really striking in the work that I've gone on to do with nutrition, that yes, food is so fundamental, but it's not always just food is first, because the mindset plays a massive factor in how we're thinking about this, how we're choosing it, how we actually accept ourselves. Are we making the right decisions for us, or because we're told that we should? And we're being misdirected in our health goals. And that, I believe that's like one of the most underestimated conversations, especially for women, because we've spoken so much about that cultural influence of the pressures that we have. And many women might say, well, maybe I don't feel that, but I think subconsciously we all have that messaging because that's what we've grown up in.
Yeah, it is. And the push to take care of everyone else first instead of us, right? And
The
I'm
mother.
always telling, yeah, the mother, even if you're not a mother, you're still thinking about work or your partner or your parents. And I'm always like, you got to take at least 10 minutes first thing in the morning just to center yourself and say, what am I doing for myself today? And make it a permanent note in your calendar so it can't be moved.
I'm so excited to share something that has been a game changer for my business. As a nutritionist and a health professional, having an online presence that truly represents my brand is crucial. I built my website on Squarespace nearly 10 years ago now, and I'm so excited to partner with Squarespace and share with you the all-in-one platform that helps entrepreneurs and health professionals like us thrive online. Now, when I started to think about building my website, I was a bit overwhelmed. Now, you don't need to worry, because the Squarespace Blueprint AI makes it easy. It feels like having a personal design assistant guiding me through creating a site that looks professional and uniquely tailored to my brand. It's been amazing for showcasing my services and connecting to you, my audience. One feature I love is the members sites. I've set up exclusive sections for my inner circle members to access premium content like courses, recipes, books, and expert blogs. It's a fantastic way to offer extra value, build a stronger community, and generate steady income. And let's talk SEO. Squarespace has built in SEO features to help make sure my website is optimized for search engines, making it easier for people to find my site and join my community. If you're a health professional or brand looking to elevate your online presence, I highly recommend Squarespace. It's been vital for growing my brand and making real impact. Check out squarespace.com/livewell for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use the offer code LIVEWELL for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Talking about this and something that I really want to make sure while we're on the context of protein, because it seems like this is now going to be like the driving factor of this conversation, is you mentioned the other diets there, like low fat, low carb. I'm still really aware that if people are saying, okay, I'll have lots of protein, I'm going to have a high protein diet. There's a 2-question part that I want to ask. One, can you have too much protein in one sitting? Because that's a big kind of conversation that's online. Some people argue you can, some people argue you can't. And secondly, how important it is to make sure that you're not having a super low carb diet if you're having a very high protein diet. And I'm thinking about people building their plates with maybe a fillet of salmon and it's hard. I say vegetables, but I talk about that. I know they're carbohydrates, but it's a very low carbohydrate diet and how that would be formed if you didn't have some brown rice or some brown pasta or whatever on the side. So in that context, it's a 2-pronged approach. Can you have too much protein? And also, what about a high protein, low carb diet for women?
Yeah. So the study that came out, I think it was 3 months ago, that was looking at the 100-gram dose of protein and how long that took to digest. And over 24 hours, it was still improving muscle protein synthesis and stuff. It was done in men. It hasn't been done in women. So we don't know definitively. And we know that there is a difference in gastric emptying rate for women versus men, the way that women respond to protein intake versus men. So when I hear that, I'm like, it's a caveat. Yes, we know there's no upper limit for men, but it was a very small N, and we don't know what the training status was. We have to look at the age. There's so many different factors that come into digestion that I'm still holding on to. Look, we know that you need regular protein throughout the day at around 30 or 40 grams at each meal, maybe 15 to 20 grams each snack. And if you're exercising, as a recreational athlete, on the days that you're not training, 3 meals and 1 snack is probably enough. And if you, on the days that you are training, you want to bookend your training with some food before and after. And that's the simplest way that I can get people to visualize what they're supposed to be doing with regards to how they space protein out. When we're looking at low carb, high protein, this is a big problem because now women are focusing more and more on that palm size or palm size and a half. And they're forgetting that you don't have to have that size of salmon or meat on the plate. You can have something that's like a bootable, right? And you're having some sweet potato, you're having some tempeh, you're having some beans, you're having slice of beef in there, you're having lots of dark green leafy veggies and some fruit. So you're having lots of complex carbs, and then you're also having your protein because there's so many different sources of protein. And I'm also, yeah, don't forget the quinoa, don't forget the amaranth or the buckwheat. Like all of those can be accents. I try to steer people more towards the visualization of like a Japanese plate, where the major things of Western society are actually the accents. And the things that are accents for the Western society, like our veggies and things, is the main course. So it's like, okay, let's bring them together. So you know that when you are having protein, I don't mean a big slab of fish. I mean, fish is in there and it's part of the accent with all the other good things that contribute to protein. And when I start saying that, and people are like, oh, I get it now. I get it. So I can have a salad at lunch that is some fruit and some spinach and some beans, and maybe I'm going to have a little bit of roasted chicken. So I'm getting all these great things and I feel satiated, but I don't feel overly full from too much, dead protein hanging out my stomach. And then we have the people who are like, what about the carnivorous diet? I'm like, that completely wrecks your gut microbiome. Like, I don't understand why people would just want to do something that's so contraindicative to having a healthy gut.
Wow, I love that. This is going to probably go a bit AWOL on YouTube with that comment, but I agree. We had Dr. Will Bolsowicz, who comes on talking a lot about obviously fiber fueled and the importance of fiber for the gut. And I think that is really important, right? I think looking at now, I'm already building out, I want to make sure that I'm keeping track of this, a perfect woman's day, which isn't always perfect. I'm going to reframe that. How a day should be looking for a woman who has no health conditions, going to put it out there, isn't excessively an athlete, not an excessive endurance training, but basically wakes up, has some water, I imagine, has either 15 grams of protein for breakfast, minimum if they're not hungry, but if not, they have a very good 30-30-30 rule, 30 grams of, 30 grams, 30% fat, 30% carbohydrate, 30% protein. And that's how we want to be building our plate. And we want to be having at least 1.6 grams of protein for 1 kilo of body weight. And we want to be spacing that constantly throughout the day. And we want to making sure that it's whole grains. We want to make sure that it's a variety of foods, a variety of proteins. It's not just a slab of one. We're really mixing it in for the diversity. That's how I'm garnering women's health on a plate or as a
Yeah.
lifestyle right now. Am
Yeah.
I right?
Perfect. You are. And then on the subsides, we have to have room for like whiskey and dark chocolate and coffee and wine as the occasional accents that makes life so fun.
That's the thing. Okay, so we're taking out any extreme and we're going real back to balance and basics here. And actually going back to our needs, it sounds like. I'm thinking about training now. So there is a huge buzz online around zone 2 training. And it's kind of supposedly holds the key to endurance and long-term health. And again, the buzzword of longevity that, we all want to have. First of all, like, why should women care about this? And is it important? Does it like fit into a woman's workout routine? Is this what we should be thinking about as the golden child of endurance training? And what is it? Because I think that some people might not know, but I think generally it's blown up online as like this golden child of women's training in general.
And I get so frustrated with it because, again, when we're looking at the data of zone 2, right, and we see who have pushed it, it's the two primary dudes that biohack and put the words out about it. Very popular podcasts, and
Can
everyone
we say
falls
who
into
they
it.
are?
Sure, Huberman and Atia, right? And we know that they put that out there, very bro science, and as an exercise physiologist, I understand the zones and I understand the idea of, yeah, we have to have base miles. But again, it's coming from that male data. So if we pull it back and look from a physiological perspective of why people are pushing zone 2, is to improve metabolic flexibility and the body's ability to uptake and utilize free fatty acids. When we look at women who come from XX, and I'll apologize in advance because we don't have any data outside of the binary of XX versus XY. When a baby is born XX, they're already born with more oxidative fibers. That means endurance fibers. And we're also born with more mitochondrial proteins within there to be metabolically flexible. Then, as we go through puberty and we get the exposure of estrogen and progesterone, we have more influence on being metabolically flexible because these two hormones change the way that our body responds to carbohydrate across the menstrual cycle. Then, as we start getting into perimenopause, we might lose those hormones, but we still have the undercurrent of mitochondrial density and better mitochondrial respiration than men. What we need to do as women is look and say, hey, wait, we don't have a lot of glycolytic or type 2 fibers, those lactate producing fibers. And we know that lactate production is really, really important for brain health. And if we don't use them, we spend so much time zone 2ing, then those crossover fibers are becoming more oxidative and we're losing our body's ability to produce lactate, which is a risk factor for dementia and Alzheimer's.
Which is the leading cause of death in the UK. I just want to put that out there because a lot of women in their 30s and 40s might not even be thinking that this is a thing. It's the leading cause of death in the UK.
And it is a significant sex difference. And I mean, there's lots of reasons from sociocultural and mind stimulation to the population that's dying now. But a physiological basis underneath is the plaque development. And that comes from misstep of the glial cells and the metabolism of the brain. We start to become more hypometabolic, meaning that our brain doesn't use blood glucose very well. So it relies more and more on lactate. And because women don't have a lot of those glycolytic type 2 fibers, we're having more and more difficulty producing that lactate. So if we bring it back down to zone 2, we don't need to do the zone 2 workouts that are being pushed so much. If you have all the time in the world, right, and you're not working and you can train as much as you want, sure, put in a lot of zone 2 because it is low intensity. It gets you out in nature and it's great. But if you're looking to maximize health and longevity, we need to take a step back from that zone 2 training as women and focus more on how are we developing these glycolytic fibers? How are we pushing true lactate production as the mainstay with our resistance training, which is also super important for brain health, as well as maintaining lean mass, right? So those become the mainstay. And then we look at zone 2 as our soul food. Like we want to go out with friends on a hike or a long ride, or we're training for a half marathon, right? Because we have this goal. We still put a precedence on that higher intensity, but we have time and a place for zone 2 because it does fit in, but it does not mean that that's what you have to do day in and day out for an hour and a half because it's so time intensive and it's not as metabolically stimulating in a positive manner for women because being that cis woman, that XX, you already have all of the fat burning capacity and the metabolic flexibility that zone 2 is trying to push. So when I say you train for zone 2, men need to do it to become more like women.
God, that's the best line I've ever heard. Men need to do it to
Thanks.
become more like women. That's going to be the title of this podcast.
Okay.
For any women that maybe are like, oh, I'm not quite sure what zone 2 is. Can you give the definition of what zone 2 training actually is and where it, like the parameters of it?
Yeah. So zone 2 is typically said to be the pace that you go that you can maintain a conversation where you're still a little bit breathless. You might be breaking a sweat, but it's pretty low intensity. If you're looking on a rating of perceived exertion scale of 0 being like you're just waking up dead on the couch and 10 being maximum full gas sprint, zone 2 sits about a 4. So you're not going too easy, but you're not going moderate to hard either. And so people are like, okay, I'm going to use a heart rate monitor. So I make sure that I'm going really super easy so they can stay in zone 2 because a lot of people don't realize how easy it actually is.
I'm going to give you two different subgroups. I'm going to give you a woman kind of 30s to early 40s, and then going more into perimenopause, into kind of the mid 40s to the mid 50s, how should these two types of women be looking at their training, whether it's zone 2 or not? What is their kind of a bit like the plate that we made? How should women be approaching their training in these two different sets?
Yeah, so across the board, all women should be doing strength training. And I don't mean our little pink dumbbells and our 3 kilo weights.
They are
You know
now
what I mean.
gone.
Right.
They're gone.
So,
They're gone.
yeah, it's when you're in your reproductive years or your younger years, you can play around a little bit more about like your 10 to 12, your hypertrophy stuff. But as we get into peri and postmenopause, we really need to look at the strength development and do neural adaptations. So we know that when we're doing the power-based stuff that's more neurally adaptive, we are also going to build lean mass and keep the impetus for building lean mass. But if we're doing more hypertrophy type training, we don't get strength. We just get a little bit of lean mass build. So when we're looking at lifting weights, we want to be strong. When we're looking at intensity and what we're doing, it's paramount that women who are perimenopausal into postmenopause do 2 to 3 high intensity interval sessions a week. So this is, either sprint interval, that's your 30 seconds or less, as hard as you can, or it's true high intensity work, not a F45 Orange Theory type class, but you're doing your every minute on the minute for 3 minutes and then having a full minute off, and then you repeat that 2 or 3 times, done and dusted in 30 minutes. And then for women who are in their reproductive years, so their 30s and early 40s, you can get away with a lot of stuff and play around a lot, right? So yes, we want some high intensity. We want polarization because we want that lactate development with the eye to, I'm getting older, I'm going to have to train my body this way anyway. But there still is room if you want to go and do ultra endurance stuff, right? You can still benefit from that. The caveat of that is, we don't want you to keep training those oxidative fibers so much that you're just going to keep getting slower and slower and slower. We have to have an eye of peppering it with that high intensity work too. So if we're looking at our 30s to early 40s, have a play, don't overtrain, eat well. You have a little bit of room to do a lot of kind of fun stuff. And then we have to become a little bit more dialed to what is the bread and butter for longevity when we get into our mid 40s onwards. The bread and butter, again, is that heavy resistance training peppered with some high intensity work. And then if you're someone who's like, I'm training for an ultra run, how do I do this? Well, yeah, we look at what you're doing when your event is. We can put in time on the feet. But again, we really want to maintain that high intensity quality work, and then we see where we fit in the longer stuff.
And I think it's important, right, to talk about this through the lifespan, because I guess, we do need to start adapting as opposed to just having a very rigid plan of, okay, I'll do a bit of resistance training and I'll maybe do a run and that's kind of it. And I'm not going to think about changing my exercise routine at all. I think that's a really important conversation, especially in the context of how we spoke about this with the bro culture that's coming up. And I really wanted to ask this a question, woman to woman, scientist to scientist. When I asked you the question in the beginning, when we were doing the 5 questions to nourish the mind, the body, and the soul for the newsletter readers of the show, something that you mentioned was about, coming up again around round tables with men every day. Now, you've obviously pioneered so much since 2019. Your TED Talk went viral. Again, one of my favorite titles. But this puts you in the arena against having conversations on podcasts with men who are that optimization culture. How do you feel having those conversations, feeling that a lot of them have been driving a certain narrative? And I can also imagine, like, because I feel very strongly about it, I respect a lot of their work, and I don't want to sound like I'm taking these people down, because I'm not. But again, I also feel very, very protective of women, and very protective of the misinformation that's out there and the shame approach that a lot of these conversations can also drive. So how have you been feeling in the last 5 years being interviewed by these people? And do you believe that they're changing their understanding, or do you believe they're just doing it to kind of get the views and the clicks and look like they're understanding it?
The latter. There are not. There are some that have actually changed. I should say that. There's definitely been a mind shift across the board. When I come onto a podcast and I'm facing the bro culture, I always take a step back and go, okay, so I'm just going to bring it down to basic physiology. And we know that there's sex differences from birth. So if we start talking about the data that's out there, I'm always going to bring it back to where's the data on women? If we don't have data on women, how are we extrapolating? Because you can't take a female rat and say, okay, we're going to put them under the same stress as a male rat and get the same outcomes. We see in science that doesn't happen. If you're looking at cell cultures, and then, if they're still not getting it, then I talk about, let's look at Ambien, right? Let's look at Ambien and the way that it affects women versus men. So you can't say that what's good for a man can work all the way through, because we know that that drug, which was done on men and then just generalized to women, it's not even based on body weight, that women have really poor metabolism of that and wake up still under the influence. And these women have been driving their kids to school, right? So it's always just bringing it back to the basic conversation of physiology. And we know that there are sex differences from birth. So let's just bring it there. And I completely respect Huerman and Atia for getting the words and the conversations out there. And I love the fact that there are biohackers, for one, and they have these in-depth conversations, and you're having the bro science conversations. But I feel awful when women go, oh, but Atia said I had to be doing this. And I'm like, but that's misinformation, which is why you're still looking for the answers. So let's direct you to the data that's on women. And then also intuitively, because we don't have a lot of robust women or data on women yet, intuitively, how does it make you feel? Like, what is working for you and what is not? Because we have this whole subjective area that's so impactful, especially when it comes to hormone flux, how women are feeling, how they're responding. And then you have the sociocultural influences that we've talked about. So we have to really bring it back down and say, okay, on the basic cellular level, we know that we have these sex differences. So as I'm talking about fasting, and we see these sex differences in fasting, if we have someone who's like, you know what, I absolutely feel nauseous and I cannot eat in the morning because I just can't do it. Well, that's the nuance, and they understand, or she understands her own body and will work with her own body. And as long as she's staying healthy and has really good longevity, then I'm not going to make her change, because we do have the bell curve, right? But for the basic information, we're talking in these bro cultures. It's like we have to bring it back down. We can't tell everyone they're smack dab in the middle of the bell. And this is what I feel like that culture is doing. So I'm trying to pull that bell apart and say, let's look at these outliers that are women, which really should be the center of the bell. But for you guys, it's the outliers. So let's talk in these corners instead of just right here in the middle.
100%. Well, men are the anomaly. We figured this out from the very start of the
Right.
conversation. Women,
Exactly.
51% of the population are women, and women are
I
only
know.
becoming more educated. More women are going to university than men. There is this kind of, I'm hoping, a big shift that's going to come. But I think it was a very it was a question I really wanted to ask you, because I feel very sucked into what is coming out on social media and the reels that are going viral and the protocols that people should be doing and the optimization culture that we should be leading. And there is this part within me where I'm like, there's a whole area of women that's just not spoken about, that again puts a huge amount of shame and pressure on women, especially if someone's having a child or having sleepless nights, and kind of listening then to these podcasts thinking, oh my God, I have like no chance in hell, so I'm going to give up. And the problem that I see is that women never kind of get off that starting line because they're too ashamed, because they can't live up to these expectations. And I think that's the opposite of what we want to be encouraging people to do for their health.
Yeah, I sit on the advisory board of a concierge medicine company that's still in stealth mode. So it's pretty exciting times. And we've been going through these cohorts, and the biggest pushback is around women and their food intake, because they're so, like, their upper socioeconomic status. They are following the trends. They're reading the magazines. They're following all the celebs. They're following the science. And yet when I ask them, how does it pertain to you as a woman who is XYZ years old? They go, well, why should it matter? Because they haven't made that connection, right? So I think the first thing that we need to do between us and our platforms is to really get women to make that connection, to say it matters, because we have to look at the origins of that protocol. And that origin of that protocol, if it was an 18 to 22-year-old guy, how does that apply to most of us who are in this conversation?
And that takes me on to the last thing, which is the contraceptive pill, which is very women focused. But again, I think there's a mismatch of information about
Absolutely.
this conversation. So can you give me kind of your thoughts around how generally the contraceptive pill can affect anything from mood to performance? Because for me, the reason why and this might go into another conversation, the reason why I went on the pill when I was 16 was because of my period, and I wanted my period to stop. And I didn't want I had really bad periods, and I didn't want them to carry on, and I didn't really understand about my periods, but I hated them. I absolutely hated them. And then when I was modeling, I mean, who wants a period when they're modeling? So having no period is the best thing in the world for me back then. Now, dangerous. So I lived like that for a very, very long time. And now I'm very passionate about having this conversation and understanding the pill in its form so people can make their own informed decision from a place of, informative knowledge. So can you give your thoughts on contraceptive pill for mood and performance and just general health?
Yeah, I mean, the pill is experimental in its own right. I mean, it was just earlier this year where they are looking at brain changes on young versus older women on the pill. And they saw that, yeah, you had a shrink of the amygdala and we had an increase in fear and anxiety, which is reversible in adults, but they don't know if it's reversible in younger girls because it's the time of brain development, right? We also know that across a natural menstrual cycle, you have areas of brain that changes because of the influence of hormones. But when we look at the OC, because the formulation hasn't, I shouldn't say it hasn't changed. The concept of it hasn't changed. Where we look at the placebo pill week, it was really put in there by men who were designing the pill to say, hey, yeah, now a woman feels like she's having a period. It was women behind it who had the idea, but they didn't have access to the lab to actually do it because they weren't allowed to be in there. So when we look at that sugar pill week, it was put in there, and people still think it's a period. Like you'll still have GPs who are like, "Oh, we'll regulate your period by putting you on the pill," but it's not. It's like it's a withdrawal bleed, and it down regulates your own ovarian function. And because it's so experimental, like I have a hard time with the ongoing blanket. Like if you have problems with your period or you have problems with your skin, you go to your GP and they're like, here's an oral contraceptive pill, right? Because there's so many other things that we can do first. Let's dig in and see what's going on. Why are we having irregular periods? Are you in the first few years of starting to menstruate? Well, yes, we're going to have lots of variability, and let's see how that shakes out. Or are you having a lot of polyps or something to that effect that we can take care of? Maybe we need to look at using an IUD, or maybe we have to look at using pomegranate extract to reduce heavy menstrual bleeding. There's so many
Oh,
different things that we
wow.
can do. Yeah.
Didn't know
It's
that was a one.
better than, yeah, it's better than tranexamic acid. Is that what it's called? The blood clotting drug
Oh,
that they
yeah.
put people on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's lots of things within it that people don't understand. And I also put, you go and you have all these teenage girls are put on the pill, not for contraceptive reasons, but for other reasons, which I find it's like, here's some Skittles, right? But then the other side of the coin, with all these women who are going with perimenopausal symptoms and going, oh, here's MHD, like without really understanding what that's doing and how that affects the individual. So it's both ends of the spectrum. And I want people to understand that the OC is not representative of your own endocrine system. It downregulates it. It downregulates it from a brain perspective. And depending on the formulation, is it what generation the progestin is? It has different effects. Is it more androgenic? Is it more estrogenic? We don't know. Depends on how it affects your body. So it's really making the choice with someone who's informed about the formulations of the pills.
Which I don't
If
know if
you
people
are,
even know who that would be, by the way, hence I'm asking the question. Because if you go to the
yeah,
doctor, it will be just have this.
yeah, endocrinologists, but there's also some really good websites of like Alloy for women who are in the States. You can get OCs or MHT, and they give you a really deep dive in the education. I think also it all comes down to we don't educate our girls around what the menstrual cycle is. We say, oh, here's textbook, it's 21 to 35 days, but we don't talk about ovulation. We don't talk about a bleed pattern and how that might change. We don't talk about what is normal for you as an individual and how you track your own normal. Like those are all the conversations that are not being had. So when a girl starts menstruating and having issues and she thinks that it's not normal, so she goes to a physician, and a physician's like, you're outside the textbook norm. Let's put you on a pill. But in fact, it might be her normal as long as it's not interfering with your daily life, which sounds like you were having significant issues with bleeding, right? That's something to investigate. But there's so many girls who are going in because of poor skin or something else. And it's like, that's not appropriate. We should have moved past that by now.
I think it's such a big topic of conversation. I've been off the pill now for 6 years. And
Yay.
I know, yeah. And it was one of those moments where I thought, oh my gosh, I've been on it for 15 years, nearly. Like it's a long time. And I felt as a woman very disconnected from my body. I'm sure my sister won't mind saying this. She's 8 years older than me and she's going through perimenopause. The first thing the doctor did was put her back on the pill. It's not obviously because of contraception.
Nope. It's to control the symptomology, but there's so many other things you can do that are natural. And I put people in this scenario. I'm like, this is the common medical view of a woman's reproductive years. You're 13 or 14, you start menstruating, your periods are a bit irregular, or you have lots of variability. Let's put you on an OC to kind of control that. And you're going through all the way up till your late 20s, and then you're like, oh, I want to try to have a kid. So you come off it, you get pregnant, and you have one kid, and then you immediately go on the progestin only mini pill because that's safe when you're breastfeeding, right?
Yep.
And then you transition off that onto another combined oral contraceptive pill, which you're used to, and then you decide you might want to have another kid or not. And you do the same thing. And then you get into your mid 40s and you're like, oh, perimenopause. Maybe I should be, thinking about that. And you go talk to your physician. They're like, no, stay on it until you go on MHT. So the whole time, like from a medical perspective, a woman's whole body is being controlled from exogenous hormones. And as a physiologist, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can just like, if you've ever seen the Queen's Gambit, when she looks up at the ceiling and she sees the chess pieces moving, that's how I see cellular functions. So I look and I'm like, oh my gosh, all these exogenous hormones that have different molecular structures and how they affect our receptors differently from our natural ones, and all the things that could possibly go wrong. I'm surprised that people are allowed to start on something that when they're 14 and go all the way through till they're 80. And it just blows my mind that other people don't think that way.
But it's the subculture that we've been living in. And I think if we actually break this down into everything, I think there is a place for everything in a world, but not as always the first resort. And I even say this with SSRIs. With some people, it's been completely life-changing and it's saved people. And it has been the only route that's been helpful. Others are given that without looking at diet, looking at lifestyle factors, looking at environmental factors, looking at the stress that's in their life, like looking at other factors first, and then knowing that there's also this secondary factor that you can put in, I think is a conversation that like we just don't have around our house. There's no preventative health.
No, there isn't.
Let's just like put a plaster on it until the plaster comes off, and then we'll put another one on.
And I blame the US health system because it's a for-profit system, right? Like New Zealand was more socialized. Yeah. And so that's what's driving it is money, right? So why would we educate people about how not to use drugs? Because then we might not make money.
It's so true. Why would we look after our health when we can like drug our health? It's crazy. We could be dope sick.
And
like
then
that documentary
and then make
on
money
Disney.
off. Oh yeah, that's right. And then we can make money on surgeries.
Exactly. So leading it to the end of this then, Ozempic, I have to just ask you because you brought it up. And I guess if I'm thinking about the target audience for Ozempic, it's going to be women. More so, I'm not saying that it's not men, but I'm predominantly thinking it's going to be women. So what do we need to be aware of when it comes to Ozempic in the conversations here?
Yeah, I get questions. I get DMs from social media asking about microdosing Ozempic for the vanity pounds. I'm like, what? No, Come on. No, we're not doing Ozempic microdosing for the last 10 to 15 pounds that you want to lose, because that is definitely sociocultural. Yes, you might feel better if you lose that weight, but let's really see like what's driving that. That's a whole nother podcast that we can get after. When we look at Ozempic itself, say, do you remember the movie Wall-E from like the early 2000s? The little robot? Yes. And there's the one scene where all the people are floating around on the couches, and then he accidentally knocks one off. And the guy's like on his screen, all of a sudden he's on the ground and he's like, oh my gosh, it's reality. But he can't get up because he has not ever stood up. I'm like, that's Ozempic society right there, right? Because you're having such rapid weight loss without the education that we have to do stuff to prevent lean mass loss. So all this rapid weight loss is not coming from fat per se, it's coming from bone and muscle. So if we're not giving the tools for people to understand how to get health benefits while they're also losing weight and getting metabolic control, then I don't want to know what society is going to look like in 20 years. It scares me, because to be responsible, we need to teach people how to lift weights. We need to teach people how to eat healthy and what it means if they don't, right? We need to teach people how to build their bones and how to sleep well, all of these things, because Ozempic can be a good tool, but it is being misused. It's like it's a tool in the toolbox, just like everything else. But everyone, to maintain health and longevity, they have to put in the work of moving your body and eating well. We're not designed to sit still all day and eat ultra processed foods, which is how we've all gotten to this point in society. We have to reteach people what it means to be human, to move and use our bodies. And Ozempic can be that tool to get you to a state where you feel free enough to start moving, but we have to put that education in as well in order to have a healthy, thriving population rather than the Wall-E falling off the couch population.
I guess there's also that conversation on, do you want to feel nauseous? Because that's one of the biggest side effects, right, of Ozempic, is feeling sick the entire time. And having, there's that kind of conversation where you were saying, and we have a bit of wine and we have a bit of this and we have a bit of that alongside the 80-20 rule. With Ozempic, that doesn't really happen. And then I think the biggest conversation that I find that doesn't happen around Ozempic is coming off Ozempic.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I will share the story because I have been allowed to. I was on a panel with a woman who is a nurse, and she was doing research on Wegovy, which is like Ozempic. And she was seeing all these people lose weight, and she was relatively overweight, obese, and some pre-diabetes stuff. And her colleagues are like, well, maybe you should try it. We're seeing all these great outcomes. And so she's like, oh, okay, I'll do that. So she got a physician, she's under guidance, she's in these clinical trials, she's, conducting it, understands it. But then they started charging, it was no longer affordable. And so she went to her insurance company, and her insurance company was like, well, you didn't get a pre-authorization, so we're not going to fund it. So when she went to get a pre-auth, they're like, well, you don't meet the qualifications. You don't weigh enough, because she lost enough weight using the Wegovy that she now no longer fit the precondition for getting on it. So they wouldn't fund it, and she couldn't afford it. So she had to come off it rapidly. And she was freaking out. She's like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I'm putting weight on. I don't know what to do. I can't get a pre-auth because I don't weigh enough. And now I've lost all this lean mass because my body composition has changed so much. So we were talking about how to, okay, you've come off it in not such a great way, but let's look at these tools that we can help to improve your health and your fitness. So we're talking about heavy lifting. We're talking about gut microbiome. And then 6 months later, check back in, she's lost the weight and she feels better without having to use the Ozempic. So I'm like, how much better would it have been if you had had those tools when you were initially on it? So then when it stopped suddenly, you didn't feel at a loss. Because I think that's the thing, like people get on it and the pharmaceutical company is saying, yeah, you can stay on it forever. It's fine. But it's not. And we don't know the long-term ramifications. Yeah.
And we don't want to be injecting ourselves every day. Also, I don't know. There's just something about that's not. And that's kind of also, type 2 diabetes. We don't want to be getting to that phase, and we don't need to be. Very different for type 1. But it's that big conversation, right? And I just think, isn't it sad that we feel as women the pressure to have to even think about microdosing? There's microdosing of things that could be great, not Ozempic. not Ozempic. Wow. Stacey, well, I've already now known what our podcast 2 is going to be. So
Okay.
thank you for that.
No worries.
That's round 2. And I have to then leave you with my final question, which I ask all my guests. It's not as terrifying as the 5 questions in the beginning that we did for the newsletter.
Okay.
So don't worry. This is a more calming one.
That's
This
good.
is more aligned with you. But again, answers from the heart and not from the mind.
Okay.
Stacey, what does live well, be well mean to you?
I'm laughing because we talked about this last night, not knowing you're going to ask this question. It's having Zimmer frame races with my mom and my sister and my daughter when we're all in our hundreds and we're all living together in a good community because we've been supporting each other and we're still laughing and having fun.
I
That's what
love
it
that.
is.
I think Dan Buettner will be there as well with you.
Okay. All right.
Who does
And
the
you can
blue
be the
zones.
referee. Yeah.
I'll be the referee.
You can be the ref. Yeah.
I'll be the ref. I'm there. I'm here. I don't mind living in New Zealand. We're not sure that's where you're going to live yet, but I don't mind.
No, I was thinking more,
living
like
somewhere.
Hawaii. Hawaii
Oh
has
yeah,
nice warm weather. Caribbean,
yeah.
maybe someplace it's always warm.
I don't want to be 100
Yeah.
living in the UK. I don't think I'd
No.
make it living to 100 living in the UK.
No.
Stacey, you've been amazing. I feel like we've really set the world straight with women's health so much in this conversation. And I really want to say at the end of this, any woman listening to this, any man listening to this, please, please share this with so many women in your life, because we are really trying to, especially Stacey is pioneering this conversation that women are not small men. And we need to be as loud as the bro culture here. We need to make sure that we're getting this out loud and clear so people feel that they have a safe space to come to and someone to, trust in this space. And that's you, Stacey. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, the inspiration. I'm hoping you're training your daughters to carry on the legacy going forward. And
working it. Yep.
they're definitely gonna grow up to be not small women, but strong women, I'm sure.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for all the work you do, Stacey. It's been amazing. And again, I'm now going to go and have my 30 meal with lots of protein in for my breakfast.
Good. Perfect. Love it.
Thank you
I've
so
had
much.
dinner already, so I don't have to.
Stacey's in New Zealand, I'm in London, so we are currently 12 hours ahead. But I know that you will, because you eat normal time. So I'm sure now you're going to go to bed having a couple of hours rested from food to get you into your deep sleep state.
That's right. That is right. Thank you.
Stacey, until next time, I hope one day we can do this in person. But it's been amazing to have you on, so thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been super fun.